There's another phrase being used as a democratic recession, which you note we've had a worldwide democratic recession since about '06. Why?
Well, I know the phrase because I invented it. It's the way I ended my last book, The Spirit of Democracy. And I will say we've not only had it since about '06, Tom, but it's getting a lot worse. Levels of freedom and democracy are steadily declining. In this year alone, we've had 5 more democracies die around the world, or slip beneath, I think, the minimum standards of democracy. And the wind seems to be increasingly blowing in our face against our liberal values and not at our backs, behind and in support of them. I think you could go back to 2005-06 and look at some of the things that changed that helped to generate this. I think the war in Iraq proved disastrous for the idea of democracy promotion. Even though I was there for 3 months, I don't think that was very much what we were doing. But in any case, it gave a bad name to the idea of democracy promotion. And that and the growing political polarization in the United States, I think, have tarnished the image of America as a shining city on a hill, to go back to the famous phrase that Ronald Reagan was so fond of quoting in explaining why he felt America had to be an example and an inspiration, as well as a promoter of democracy in the world. Then we had the financial crisis that was a global financial crisis, the most serious since the Great Depression, that was originated here in the United States as a result of the subprime mortgage crisis and wanton misbehavior in the financial sector, and therefore the breakdown of government regulation. And the whole model of liberal democracy in the United States began to lose its luster, prestige, stature in the world, and we began to lose our self-confidence as a democracy. We backed away from promoting democracy around the world. We backed away from making clear to dictators that there would be consequences for their abuse of human rights and constitutionalism. And more leaders now around the world, I'm sad to say, particularly since January of 2017, have the sense that they can lock up their opponents, oppress the media, stack the judiciary, condemn their political rivals as treasonous, take control of the political playing field and create unfair rules, and there will be no consequences from the United States. Instead, you might be welcomed in the White House as the Turkish autocrat Recep Tayyip Erdogan was yesterday, in an event that was not as significant as the other thing that was happening yesterday, but that will certainly be more noticed in Turkey than the other thing that happened yesterday. And the message that goes out is, if you're a strong leader, if you're a strong man, basically, if you're a powerful autocrat, you will have the admiration and not the sanction of the United States.
And you talk about that in the book. You
I talk about it at length, yeah.
Countries across the world where the slide is very prevalent. It's interesting though, this book came out in June, which meant this book.
You mean this book?
Available
on Amazon. Yeah.
On Amazon, in your groceries freezer, all of it. But it came out in June, which meant you would have had to submit it probably last December-ish.
Right. Yeah.
So just in the time since you submitted the manuscript, what would you have to add to the book if we were updating it today?
Well, I can tell you what I did add in the last couple of weeks, because I just wrote the preface to the paperback edition.
Yeah.
But that won't be out for a few months,
Yeah.
so you can still buy hardcover. Or you can wait for the paper version. Tom, here are some of the things that have been happening that I think show acceleration of this slide. You've probably all been following the ongoing political crisis in Bolivia, where a president defied the Constitution, defied a national referendum that wouldn't grant him a fourth term. Evo Morales ran anyway, rigged the election, and then people finally said enough, and they came out into the streets, and it took the kind of military and police to induce him to resign. But now he's leaving behind a shattered system, a deeply polarized country, and deep uncertainty about who really is the legitimate president of the country. You've got this extremely illiberal, strongman populist, also deeply admired by our president, Rodrigo Duterte, who has been using much of the same language of, the media's fake news, the media's treasonous, people who oppose me are not loyal to the country, who has purged the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, locked up his principal Senate rival, and presided over the extrajudicial execution of more than 12,000 alleged drug traffickers who were not given the basic right of a fair trial before somebody put a bullet in their back. And we have lost this year. I think finally we have to acknowledge that. Not just another democracy, but a long-time critical pillar of stability in East Asia that has 100 million people. The Philippines is not a small country. And you've seen backsliding in Senegal, backsliding in Benin, a rotten election in Guatemala. So we've got 5 fewer democracies, and we've got other authoritarian inclined, illiberal parties that have a hegemonic project based on nationalism, based on religious chauvinism, and based on intolerance of minorities and demonization of immigrants. I'm talking about the largest democracy in the world, India, and the largest Central and East European democracy, Poland. I'm not saying that neither of these systems are any longer democracies, but they're sliding away. You can see the retreat from liberal values. You can see the retreat from tolerance and religious pluralism. And the trend is worrisome, because we know if this slide keeps happening, suddenly you wake up, it's like the frog in the boiling water, and you don't even have democracy anymore.
There seems to be, especially in the post-World War II era, of this work done by democratic societies to encourage other democratic societies, sometimes with questionable means, with all of its ills and not. But the idea was, let's do our thing. Let's have America, Britain and France and all of these do our thing to encourage more democracies in the world. And it had, whatever success it had. It seems like now the opposite's happening. And some of it's happening through some of the stuff we saw Russia do in our election, that the illiberal countries are saying, hey, we're getting the band back together, come join us. And that it's not just simple enough to say that Bolivia is backsliding or if the Philippines are backsliding, it's because other from the group are encouraging them on.
Well, I think multiple things are going on. One is that there is increasingly in the international environment where the momentum, or there's a great term the Germans have, Zeitgeist, zeitgeist is the spirit of the times. There's a sense now that the spirit of the times is no longer a liberal democratic spirit. Or to go back to the way the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan put it in the mid-1970s, he was someone I greatly admired, but he was wrong about this. Democracy is the way the world was, not where it is going. And he was wrong then, but maybe now, we're at the point where more and more people are thinking in Asia and Africa and the post-communist world, well, liberal democracy is where the world was, and China and Russia are the strong, dynamic countries in the world. In any case, China and Russia are pouring money in trying to reshape the world and reshape the narrative globally, and the media and the social media and so on, to their liking. And each country recognizes, neither of them illiberal democracies, they're both deeply authoritarian regimes. Each of them recognizes or believes that if there are any more transitions to democracy in the world, there will be more examples that their own people might get ideas about. So they're deeply involved in trying to shore up, for example, Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, because they don't want to, first of all, lose this kind of foothold of an anti-American oil regime in the Western Hemisphere, or second of all, have one more example of a popular revolution that overthrows a dictatorship. And so they're backing the military in Sudan. They're encouraging the military in Algeria. Well, don't go give in to popular demonstrations. You see what Russia is doing in Ukraine to try and undermine their sovereignty and defeat democracy there. I don't know if any of you read the New York Times the other day, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I thought I was transported back to the 1970s. The Russians had agents on the ground in a very crude fashion, but it ultimately had a poisonous outcome, in Madagascar, basically trying to buy people up, to buy up an African election. This wasn't even China, which is, really got the money to do this and is bribing leaders around the world. This was Russia. And so we're facing a very sobering international situation where our image is diminished, our tools are diminished. We closed down the U.S. Information Agency in the late 1990s because we thought the Cold War was won. And Jesse Helms basically said to the Clinton administration, well, you can keep the U.S. Information Agency, or you can keep the U.S. Agency for International Development, but you can't have them both. So you close down one of them, and then I'll release your foreign aid budget. And that's how the most important instrument for advancing our story in the world, and now it would have been for defending against global disinformation and continuing to shore up liberal values and liberal allies in the world, died. And I will just say, I quoted in the book, it's one of the things I believe most strongly in terms of what we need to do internationally, and then I hope we can talk about how we repair our own democracy. I strongly agree with the argument of our former director of national intelligence, who's one of the people in our foreign policy space I most admire, James Clapper. If I could recommend another book, it would be his memoir, Facts and Fears. But he said, look, for the era we're entering in now, where Russia and China are trying to poison this space and disinform democracies around the world and promote authoritarian, not liberal values and ideas, we need a U.S. information agency, again, on steroids.
So that, the book doesn't just bring us down. It says, here are some things we can do. And
I just told you one.
Yeah, and the U.S. comes in, obviously, for its own analysis with the current state of things. So what are the things? What are the fixes? What are the things that help chip back at everything you've just talked about?
So a lot of them are, of course, international. In fact, we continue to spend a growing amount of money in support of the work of the National Endowment for Democracy and making grants to independent media, human rights groups, political reform efforts, anti-corruption efforts, political parties, legislative training efforts around the world. Quiet, prosaic work that most people don't know about, but it's very important and valuable. There's a lot more we need to do that I don't have the time to detail now, but that's very specific work I think we could do to counter Russian and Chinese, what I call sharp power. This is not really soft power. It's not meant to persuade. It's meant to penetrate our political, economic, and social systems, including in the case of the Chinese Communist Party state, our universities, our media, our think tanks, and try and neutralize them toward a pro-China view of things and away from a pro-democratic perspective. But the other thing we need to do is reform and repair our own model. If we don't have a model of democracy at home that is less polarized, more functional, more able to generate an underlying sense of common purpose in our democracy, and less full of vitriolic partisan poison, it's going to be very hard to go abroad to any of these regions and say, be like us, or do as we say and not as we do. And so I got a lot of reforms I talk about in this book that I think can revive and strengthen and renew and revitalize our democracy. Some of them are obvious. I don't think there'd probably be many people in this room that would not agree with them, like an end to partisan gerrymandering, making it easier and not more difficult to vote by passing motor voter laws, by enabling, if not standardized, at least easily used mail-in ballots, by giving felons who have done their time the right to vote, by renewing the 1965 Voting Rights Act so that we can more vigorously use the power of the Department of Justice and the federal government to fight pernicious and shameful efforts at voter suppression that we're seeing rise up again in a number of states. But I don't think any of these will be sufficient if we don't change the incentive structure of our politics to make compromise more rewarding and to enable a new generation of fair, more open, more competitive politics. And this is why I believe so passionately, at least this is my view, that the reform that is at the top of the list in terms of being what I call in the book the Archimedean lever of political transformation is ranked choice voting.
What a coincidence for that. What a coincidence.
I'm glad to hear that resonates here in Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Which both have it for local elections, not yet for state or federal elections, as other states like Maine have. Ranked choice voting, just for guests, for newcomers who don't know, you have the candidates, you get to pick your first choice. Larry's my first choice, Tom's my second choice, Jeannie's my third choice. And then as the votes are tallied, the runoff, you eliminate a primary and the runoff, the instant runoff happens. So if Larry has the fewest votes, whoever voted for him first, whoever those people voted for second, gets redistributed between Jeannie and me. And so you don't actually keep doing that. You don't actually need 50% plus one. That's a misconception, but that's a minor detail. But that's the concept. I live in St. Louis Park, which just debuted it last week, or whenever the election was, and we had one race in which a runoff was used, but there were 3 candidates. But it's so interesting that for this whole thing we just talked about, I mean, you laid out a pretty heavy thing that's gonna visit us in our dreams. And you say, for all of this, the thing I want to see happen the most is ranked choice voting, the ability to pick your first, second, and third choice. The initial reaction to seeing that doesn't seem congruent to the moment that we're in. Why is it?
Well, we are in a moment of, I won't say unprecedented, but I'd say unprecedented for about a century now, political polarization in the United States. You have to go back to the late 19th century to find levels of political polarization, at least in terms of, I mean, we've got very precise measurements of this in terms of congressional voting behavior. And so if you look at the degree of partisan polarization in terms of voting behavior of Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate, starts up here in the late 19th century, goes down like this, and of course with our common purpose in World War II, goes down to a very low level, continues through the 1960s and early 70s, and then it starts creeping up, and it just shot up like this in the last 20 to 30 years. And why is this, Tom? I think the principal reason, well, the Southern Democrats disappeared and became Republicans. The Northeastern Republican liberals like Nelson Rockefeller disappeared and moved to be independents, or in some cases Democrats. States became, thank you Minnesota for not being one of them, more uniform in their partisan orientation. So we've got kind of fewer swing states, many fewer swing congressional districts. And as party primaries have taken hold in a kind of universal way, and as the parties have become more ideologically sorted, what we now have is a two-step process. First, in order to be elected, you have to, of course, win a party primary. I'll come back to the of course part. You get the nomination of the Republicans or the Democrats, or in Minnesota, the DFL, by winning a low turnout party primary. Who turns out in a low turnout party primary? It is generally the people, this makes sense, who are more ideologically passionate and committed. Now, Ornstein and Mann in their book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, argue this is largely a unipolar phenomenon. The Republicans are going off the Tea Party cliff. I will tell you as a political scientist, my reaction to that at the time was, just wait, Norm, for the other shoe to drop. And I think to some extent it is dropping now, and we're seeing the mirror reaction in the Democratic Party, which is, just as a descriptive statement, is moving further to the left. And this leaves a lot of people who are in the middle without a choice. And it also means that you've got congressional delegations, particularly the Republicans, and you can see the trend in their voting behavior moving way up in an ideological direction. Democrats more gradually down toward the left, but I think that's going to accelerate. And the distance between them becomes more and more unbridgeable. Moreover, because you have to win a party primary in order to win a general election, because we have first past the post in the United States, not for the city council in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but for every state legislature, for every congressional district seat, for every governor, and of course for President of the United States. Because of that, it's extremely difficult. I realize it happened a couple times here, but it's extremely difficult for anyone other than a Republican or a Democrat to win a general election. Because most people think they're going to waste their votes by voting for somebody other than a Republican or a Democrat. Because it's first past the post, whoever gets the most votes wins. So if you vote for an independent, maybe he or she will get 10, 15, 20, 25% of the vote. But maybe you really don't want the other party, and so if you give your choice to the independent, you may be helping to elect the party and the candidate you most fear. And as we go toward the extremes, fear is the dominant phenomenon. And it makes it more and more difficult for independents or other alternatives to gain traction. So if you first have to win a party primary in a low turnout, ideological, highly mobilized setting, in order to then win this first past the post general election, it's going to produce this separating phenomenon. Maybe you're not as ideological as you kind of needed to gesture at being in order to win the party primary. Maybe once you get to Washington, D.C., you realize it's more complicated. You can't prevail with a one-party agenda and you need to compromise. Then you find out, well, if you compromise on immigration, if you compromise on the budget, if you even think about voting to hold accountable a president who mortgaged our national security and our whole foreign policy to a corrupt effort to benefit his re-election effort, you will lose the next party primary. And then you have no chance of surviving because first of all, we have something called the sore loser rule in about 45 states in the United States, which means if you lose a party primary, you're not even allowed to have your name on the ballot in a general election. But second of all, even if you could get your name on the ballot, you're a spoiler in the general election where it's mainly R and D that counts. I think this system is becoming deeply perverse in terms of disincentivizing compromise, disrewarding moderation, and blocking competition and innovation. And it is particularly mysterious to me that people who say they believe in competition and open markets and low barrier to entry in the economic sphere are absolutely against it in the political sphere, which I regard as inconsistent at the least. I just want to say a lot of what I said was very dark, I realize, but I end this book on a very hopeful note. And the reason why I do so is because political reform is being adopted at the state level in many states. Michigan just voted in a motor voter law and eliminated gerrymandering. Several states are voting to eliminate voter gerrymandering and give the power to draw district ballots to independent commissions. There's all sorts of other political reform legislation that's on the agenda in multiple states, including ranked choice voting in Alaska and Massachusetts. And finally, New York City just adopted ranked choice voting, at least for its primary elections, and I thought the vote was going to be close. The vote was 73% in favor of ranked choice voting. When you explain it to voters, I don't know as much about legislators, but I do know when you explain it to ordinary people, they really like it. They realize our system is broken, and they want more choice and more incentives toward compromise.
Right. It's a reform that's accelerating. I like to use the hockey stick analogy. It took a long time to really demonstrate nationally that this reform is what we think it's going to be and what we know it can do. And now it's accelerating like this. It's unstoppable, and that's what gives us great faith that we can do this.